Hello. Tonight, we will embark on a journey back to the beginning of the 20th century, where legendary intellectual figures have left their marks on history, so that you can sit still and listen to the wind whistling through old memories. Imagine you are lying in a quiet room with towering bookshelves in Frankfurt. Outside is the sound of steady rain falling on cobblestone streets, candlelight flickering on an oak table, and a story about to unfold that makes you both curious and sleepy. To be honest, if you were thrown back to that time, you probably wouldn't survive. Because there was no Wi-Fi, no fast food delivery apps, and no Netflix buttons for you to scroll back and forth whenever you felt bored. Before lying down comfortably, remember to like and subscribe to the channel, but only if you truly find what I do here lovely and valuable. And also, try commenting to share where you are listening to this story and what time it is now. Now, please dim the lights, turn on the air conditioner or the white noise machine for a gentle background sound, and let's drift together into tonight's journey. We travel to the heart of Germany, the proud city of Frankfurt, where in 1903, a baby boy let out his first cry. That child was born into a wealthy merchant family, sheltered in a glass house, filled with the piano music of his mother and aunt, amidst the compositions of Beethoven and the scent of classical aristocracy. Let your mind drift back, far back, to an autumn afternoon in 1,903 inches, Frankfurt am Main. You are not just listening to a story, you are that child, Theodor Ludwig Wiesengrund, the one who would later spend his entire life peeling back the painful layers of the modern world. You were born on September 11, when the pale golden rays of the old German Empire still lingered on the cobblestone streets and the houses of ancient architecture. In the Wiesengrund household, the air was always filled with a characteristic scent, the smell of expensive wine barrels from your father's shop, Oscar Alexander, blending with the scent of old sheet music and the woody aroma of the grand piano. You opened your eyes to the world in an environment you would later call a hothouse. Imagine a flower nurtured in a warm, moist atmosphere, completely secluded from the freezing winds outside. Your father was a successful merchant, a Jew who had converted to Protestantism to integrate into Frankfurt's elite. But your soul was molded by two women, your mother, Maria, a professional singer once renowned in royal courts, and Aunt Agatha, a talented pianist. They enveloped you in an almost absolute love, an overprotection that made you feel like a skinless being. Every vibration of the world, even the smallest, is transmitted directly into your sensitive nervous system without any filter. You felt music before you knew words. Aunt Agatha sat beside you on the velvet upholstered armchair, her hands gliding over the black and white keys, teaching you to play four-hand duets when your tiny hands were not yet long enough to span an octave. Music was not just a hobby, it was your mother tongue. At the age of 12, while other children were engrossed in active games on the street, you could sit quietly for hours to decode the complex structures in Beethoven's sonatas. You saw the world through musical notes. To you, the harmony of sound was the symbol of a rightful world, a place where everything had its position. You studied piano and composition with Bernhard Seklis at the Hoch Conservatory. Under his guidance, you learned not only technique, but also how to listen to the breath of the German musical tradition. Your head is full of Beethoven, and in that hothouse space, you believed that beauty and truth were one. But then, the doors of that hothouse were forced open when you entered the Kaiser Wilhelm Gymnasium in 1913. This was the first time you collided with the barbarism of the outside world. While at home, you were a revered prodigy. At school, you were an eccentric. You were overly intelligent, your demeanor too elegant, and you carried Jewish blood, which society at the time began to view with suspicion. There was a group of students who called themselves the Innocuous Club, but what they did to you was anything but innocuous. They surrounded you in the schoolyard, pushed you against a wall, and mocked. Give our regards to Father Abraham. That feeling of pain, that solitude, was not just the sadness of a bullied child, it was a deep-seated scar, a prototype for your later theories on how the collective oppresses the individual. You realized that behind the civilized appearance of the school lay an instinctive brutality. You began to understand there is no right life and the wrong one. Es gibt kein richtiges Leben, I am falschen. The world outside was not a harmonious sonata, but a mess of hatred and rage waiting to erupt. Amidst those suffocating days at school, you found a new intellectual escape. They were Saturday afternoons tinted with pale sunlight in Siegfried Kracauer's study. Kracauer was 14 years older than you, a sharp critic with eyes that always saw through the illusions of society. The two of you sat side by side, before you the Critique of Pure Reason by Immanuel Kant. But Kracauer did not teach you philosophy as a dry, dogmatic system. He taught you how to read texts, as if examining a map full of cracks. He showed you the contradictions, the scars of history hidden deep beneath the flashy words of the sages. Those afternoons changed you forever. You realized that philosophy was not for seeking comfort, but for unmasking the truth. You owed these reading sessions more than any university professor later on. Kracauer helped you understand that even the most sublime thoughts bear the mark of suffering and injustice in society. You began to see the world not as it is, but as a collection of fragments that needed to be decoded. While you were preoccupied with Kant and Beethoven, the old world you knew began to collapse. In 1914, World War I broke out. Although you were only a one-year-old boy then, the thick atmosphere of nationalism and the roar of war machines echoed into your hothouse. You witnessed the young men of Frankfurt heading to the front with frenzied excitement, only to have what returned be corpses or soldiers with shattered souls a few years later. The collapse of the old European order was not just a historical event, it was an existential shock to you. You saw the values your parents worshipped, culture, music, education, all become helpless before the muzzles of the military's guns. You began to read the resistant works of the era. You held in your hands The Theory of the Novel by Georg Lukács and The Spirit of Utopia by Ernst Bloch. Those pages set your mind on fire. You began to long for a root-level change, a way to save humanity from alienation. You were no longer just the child who played the piano. You were becoming a thinker with agonizing questions about existence. By 1920, as you prepared to graduate as valedictorian from the Kaiser Wilhelm Gymnasium at age 17, you were no longer the frail flower in the hothouse. You carried within you the extreme sensitivity of an artist and the sharpness of a philosopher. You had tasted both the sweetness of music and the bitterness of discrimination. You looked ahead toward the University of Frankfurt, where the doors of academic knowledge were wide open, but in your heart, you had already understood. Truth does not lie in quiet lecture halls, but in the fierce contradictions of life. You walked the streets of Frankfurt, your feet feeling the firmness of the ground, but your soul always suspended between the notes of Beethoven and the lines of Kant's philosophy. A peaceful and turbulent chapter of childhood had closed to make way for a journey in search of truth amidst a world that was gradually losing its reason. You were preparing to enter the university lecture halls, where you would be not just a student, but a silent observer, beginning to lay the first bricks for a tower of thought that would later shake the century. Everything around you, now your father's scent of wine, your mother's singing, and those afternoons reading with Krakauer, all was crystallizing, forming a complex persona of Theodor Adorno. You knew that you would never be able to return to the absolute peace of the old hothouse, but the warmth from there would be the energy source that helped you endure the coldness of the truths you were about to discover. You took a deep breath, feeling the atmosphere of Frankfurt in the early 20s, and stepped forward. The heavy wooden gates of the high school closed behind you, and you stepped straight into the marble corridors of Johann Wolfgang Goethe University in Frankfurt in 1921. At this time, you were only 18 years old, but your mind was already an ocean filled with the undercurrents of knowledge. You brought with you the warmth of the hothouse from your family, the sensitivity of a skinless person, and the scars from the days of being bullied in the schoolyard. Frankfurt in the 1920s was not just a city. It was a nuclear reactor of new ideas, where the ghosts of classical German philosophy danced with the rebellion of modernism. You did not choose a narrow path. You threw yourself into philosophy, sociology, psychology, and musicology, like a thirsty man who has found a spring. You moved between lecture halls with a proud haste. To you, learning was not about accumulating information, but an anatomy of reality. You sat in the seminars of Professor Hans Cornelius, a neo-Kantian with a stern demeanor. Under the dim yellow lights of the classroom, you began to peel away the structures of consciousness. You found yourself drawn to Edmund Husserl's phenomenology, but your innate sensitivity made it impossible for you to accept reducing this world to pure notions within the brain. You wondered, how can we speak of the transcendence of consciousness when the world out there is still groaning under the weight of matter? In just 3 short years, you completed your undergraduate studies and finished your doctoral thesis. In 1924, at the age of 21, an age when many are still struggling to find their direction, you stood before the examining board to defend your work. The transcendence of the object and the noematic in Husserl's phenomenology. You wrote as if using a scalpel to slice through the veil of idealism. You argued that reality is not something we can possess through thought. It always has a transcendent part, a part out of reach, always resisting the imposition of the subject. Your sharpness astonished the professors. You were not just studying philosophy, you were challenging it from within. But for you, the university was not just about stacks of old books. It was where you met kindred spirits, people who would help you build the message in a bottle for humanity later on. In Cornelius's seminars, you encountered Max Horkheimer. Imagine that moment. 2 brilliant minds, one with the calm, practical air of an administrator, the other with the ethereal, melancholic grace of an artist, recognized each other in the crowd. It was the beginning of one of the greatest intellectual friendships of the 20th century. You and Horkheimer did not just exchange ideas. You were building a shield together against the collapse of Western reason. Also during these brilliant years, you met Walter Benjamin. Benjamin was like a wise ghost, a man with sad eyes and a strange mind, combining Marxism with Jewish mysticism. Benjamin taught you that truth does not lie in macro systems, but in fragments, small details forgotten by history. Truth is the death of intention, and you began to learn how to look into the cracks of civilization to find what was hidden. And of course, there were the Saturday afternoons with Siegfried Kracauer. Now, you had moved away from Kant to enter the labyrinth of Hegel and the dark reflections of Kierkegaard. In a room smelling of tobacco and the warmth of tea, Krakauer taught you to see contradiction as the heartbeat of history. You realized that philosophy was not a polished ivory tower, but a battlefield full of scars. You began writing music criticism for prestigious journals like Zeitschrift für Musik. Your pen was uncompromising. When you heard Stravinsky's The Soldier's Tale in 1923, you did not hesitate to call it a gloomy bohemian joke. You hated superficiality. You hated music that was merely for entertainment without the pain of thought. Music and philosophy were always a unified, inseparable entity within you. You composed your first string quartet in 1921, and piano pieces deeply marked by exploration. You did not want your music to be a soothing melody to lull people into a mindless sleep of compromise. You wanted it to be a wake-up cry. You felt yourself standing between two worlds. On one side, the glorious tradition of Beethoven and Brahms, and on the other, the disintegration of classical structures. The biggest turning point came on a summer night in 1,924 inches Frankfurt. You went to see the premiere of Alban Berg's Three Fragments from Wozzeck. When the first notes rang out, you felt a surge of electricity run down your spine. It was the music you had been searching for. It was modern. It was shattered. But it was full of humanity and empathy for human suffering. Berg's music did not cover up the wounds of society. It exposed them. You realized that you could not just stand at a distance and criticize. You had to immerse yourself in the crucible of that creativity. After the performance, you met Berg. His gaze, his warmth, and his genius completely convinced you. You decided that, as soon as you held your doctorate in your hand, you would leave Frankfurt, the place that had nurtured you in an intellectual hothouse, to go to Vienna. Vienna, the city of dreams and nightmares, where Alban Berg and Arnold Schoenberg were destroying the traditional musical system to build a new language. At this moment, you stood at the crossroads of your life. A 21-year-old doctor of philosophy with a bright future in academia, but your heart beat to the rhythm of atonal music. You carried with you the thoughts of Husserl, the irony of Krakauer, and the fresh hope from Horkheimer. You were preparing to step out of the protection of Frankfurt to venture into a larger world where beauty and barbarism were beginning an endless conflict. Imagine you are closing the last boxes of books in your room. You look out the window and see Frankfurt sinking into the darkness of twilight, a darkness that seems to signal something great and terrifying to come. But in your hand is Berg's score, and in your head are the ideas of a philosophy that could change the world. You are no longer the child bullied in the schoolyard. You are becoming a traveler on the path of thought, ready to face all the transcendence of life. You knew that the journey in Vienna would not be easy. It would be the place where you would test your sensitivity, where you would learn how to turn fragmented sounds into a message for the future. But for now, as night falls, you allow yourself a little rest. The sound of Aunt Agatha's piano seems to still echo somewhere in your subconscious, like a reminder of your roots, of where the flower in the hothouse began to sprout. Tomorrow, you will depart. A new chapter is opening, where philosophy and music will merge into one in a desperate but glorious effort to understand the nature of humanity. You close your eyes, listening to your heartbeat. Join the rhythm of a changing world, and prepare for the train to Vienna. The night train leaving Frankfurt carried you a young doctor with luggage consisting of unfinished compositions and a soul sensitive to an extreme degree to Vienna in February 1925. Imagine you are sitting by the train window, watching the dim lights of the suburbs glide past. You did not come to Vienna to seek comfort. You came there to find a new language. If Frankfurt was a protective hothouse, then Vienna at this time was a laboratory of nightmares and broken dreams, where music was no longer melodious tunes lulling the bourgeoisie to sleep, but screams tearing through the night. You sought out Alban Berg, whom you hailed as my teacher and master. Berg did not just teach you about music. He taught you how to channel suffering into structure. Twice a week, you sat with him in a room overflowing with shadows and the silence of creativity. Under Berg's guidance, you began to hone your works in an atonal style. You wrote 2 pieces for string quartet, Op. 2, where notes no longer sought a peaceful tonic chord, but drifted like fragments of a shipwreck. You felt you were touching the core of existence, disintegration. But Vienna was also a place of great ghosts. You entered the circle of the Second Viennese School, where Arnold Schoenberg reigned like a stern god. You admired Schoenberg, but his presence made you tremble. He represented an iron discipline, the 12-tone technique. You observed how Schoenberg transformed music into a rigorous mathematical system, an attempt to impose order on chaos. However, in the mind of a skinless person like you, a doubt began to sprout. You wondered, is imposing a rigid system on music another form of the oppression of reason? You began to have reservations about the orthodoxy of this technique, arguing that it should not become an a priori formula detached from the authentic emotion of the work. During the day, you buried yourself in the piano keys, with the artist Eduard Stuermann, trying to make your hands obey the most complex structures. At night, you immersed yourself in the satirical atmosphere of Karl Kraus at lectures, or debated Marxism with Georg Lukács. Vienna now appeared in your eyes as a symbol of irony, the outward glamour masking an internal rot. You wrote for the magazine Anbruch, using your pen like a sword to attack what you called the stabilized music of Stravinsky or Hindemith. You considered it a cowardly compromise with reality, a fake attempt to find harmony in a world already shattered. But then, a cold reality began to invade your mind. You realized that no matter how genius you were, this world had no place for a composer who only knew how to write of atonal pain. The music market was a machine that crushed differences, and your compositions were too difficult, too dark to sustain you. Professional disillusionment began to spark. You felt like an artist trying to paint on water. The avant-garde music you worshipped was being isolated in its very nobility. In 1927, you decided to return to Frankfurt. It was not a retreat, but a strategic diversion. You realized that to understand why music failed to liberate humans, you had to return to philosophy, the tool that would help you illuminate the structure of society. You submitted your first habilitation thesis titled The Concept of the Unconscious in the Transcendental Theory of Mind to your former teacher, Hans Cornelius. But this was exactly when the irony of fate struck. Cornelius, and even your close friend Max Horkheimer, advised you to withdraw that thesis. Why? Because it was too similar to Cornelius's own thought. You, someone who always craved intellectual independence, were seen as a shadow of your own teacher. The moment you withdrew the thesis in early 1928 was an existential shock. You found yourself standing in the void, not an established composer, nor yet a university lecturer. During those precarious years, you sought Berlin as an antidote. There, you reunited with Walter Benjamin and Ernst Bloch. Discussions in Berlin's cafes were no longer about closed philosophical systems, but about the fragments of urban life, about the collapse of bourgeois values. And it was also in Berlin that you met Gretel Karplus, a woman with an intellect as sharp as your own, who would later become your wife, partner, and the skin protecting you from the storms of life. In 1929, amidst the clutter of emotions and career, Paul Tillich offered you an olive branch, a new thesis topic on Søren Kierkegaard. You threw yourself into work like a madman. You saw in Kierkegaard a melancholic soul like your own, someone trying to find meaning in individual existence within a cold, objective world. Kierkegaard, construction of the aesthetic began to take shape. You were not just writing about Kierkegaard, you were using him to reflect your own pain and solitude. By 1930, an important change took place in Frankfurt. Max Horkheimer became the director of the Institute for Social Research. You began to associate more closely with the Institute, which would become your intellectual home for the rest of your life. You wrote music criticisms that were no longer purely musical analysis, but sociological analysis. You realized that music was a mirror reflecting the oppression of society. This was the moment the transition to critical theory officially began. You stood there, in the Frankfurt of 1930, with a doctorate, a nearly completed thesis on Kierkegaard, and a budding love with Gretel. You had passed through Vienna, tasted the flavor of failure and transformation. You were no longer the flower in the hothouse of 1920, but the skinless sensitivity remained, now wrapped in an armor of cold, critical thought. Imagine you are standing on the bridge over the River Main, watching the swift currents beneath your feet. Behind you is the past, with music and unfinished dreams. Ahead of you is a murky future, where the shadows of fascism are beginning to loom large over Germany. You feel a freezing wind blowing from the horizon. The world you know is standing at the edge of the abyss, and you know you cannot just stand there and observe. Your message in a bottle is starting to have its first lines written, not with musical notes, but with reflections on the salvation of humanity in a dark age. You take a deep breath, feeling the solitude, but also the freedom of an intellectual seeking their own path. Vienna taught you how to listen to disintegration. Berlin taught you how to see the fragments, and Frankfurt is giving you a foothold to begin your intellectual battle. You turn back to your room, where the book on Kierkegaard awaits, and begin to write. The atonal notes still echo in your head, but now they have become the rhythm for a new journey, the journey into the heart of social critique. Now, imagine you are standing before the stone steps of the University of Frankfurt on a spring morning in 1931. The wind from the River Main blows past, carrying the chill of the transition between seasons. You adjust your collar, take a deep breath. At 27, after years of diligent work between philosophy and music, between Frankfurt and Vienna, you have finally reached the goal respected by society. You officially become a university lecturer, privatisant. In your hand is the manuscript of the book Kierkegaard, Construction of the Aesthetic. Kierkegaard, Construction des Ästhetischen. You have overcome the failure of your first thesis to assert your position under the sponsorship of Paul Tillich. But you do not enter the lecture hall with the posture of a traditional scholar wishing to bestow eternal truths. In your inaugural lecture, titled The Actuality of Philosophy, Die Aktualität der Philosophie, you stand before a crowd of students and veteran colleagues, declaring a shocking thing. Philosophy has failed to grasp the entirety of reality. You challenge the long-held belief that thought can encompass the whole world. You tell them in a calm but powerful tone that philosophy must now penetrate the smallest details, the fragments of life, to break through the block of existing reality. For you, the whole is the false. Das Ganze ist das Unwahre. and the task of the writer is to dissect those fragments to find the hidden truth. This is the most brilliant period in your academic life in Germany. You become an indispensable part of the Institute for Social Research, under the direction of Max Horkheimer. In the quiet corridors of the Institute, you and Horkheimer weave the first theories of what would later be called critical theory. You write articles for the Institute's journal, analyzing On the Social Situation of Music, zur gesellschaftlichen Lage der Musik. You see in musical notes not just pure art, but echoes of class oppression and human alienation. Yet, your persona is always a collection of fascinating paradoxes. While writing profound and somber philosophical essays, you live the life of a dandy. You attend masquerade balls in a Napoleon costume, gliding through cultural salons with the demeanor of a bourgeois aristocrat. You use the pseudonym Hector Rottweiler to write militant music reviews. Hector Rottweiler, a name that sounds like a fierce guard dog, is defending the final boundaries of serious art against the invasion of kitsch. You attack the ease of popular culture with biting irony, as if you are trying to erect a barrier of words to protect the hothouse of your soul. At the end of 1932, in a final effort to hold on to the innocence of childhood, you composed the Singspiel, The Treasure of Indian Joe, based on the work of Mark Twain. You immerse yourself in the world of Tom Sawyer and Huckleberry Finn, seeking a fictional peace. But Walter Benjamin, the great friend with melancholic eyes, saw through your intention. He criticized this work as a futile retreat into the past. Benjamin understood that your hothouse was under threat, and no treasure of childhood could protect you from the darkness descending upon Germany. The 30th of January, 1933. Hitler becomes chancellor. A giant black shadow begins to loom over all of Europe. But remember, at that time you were still very naive. You and Horkheimer still believed that this madness would only last a few months. You thought that the German bourgeoisie, with the culture of Beethoven and Goethe, would soon grow tired of a demagogue like Hitler. You relied on your family status, on the wealth of your wine merchant father as a cushion to protect you. You were still the flower in the hothouse, believing that the glass walls, though fragile, were still strong enough to stop the storm. The irony of fate reached its peak on the 23rd of March 1933. That was the day Hitler officially seized dictatorial power through the Enabling Act. And it was on that very day that your book on Kierkegaard was published and displayed on bookshelves. A philosophical work on inwardness and aesthetics, born at the exact moment of the death of freedom. It was a tragic coincidence. While you were trying to liberate human thought, the real world was tightening the chains. In April 1933, the law for the restoration of the professional civil service was enacted. This was not a law to restore anything. It was a law to purge. And you, Theodor Ludwig Wiesengrund Adorno, were one of the first targets. You were no longer considered a citizen, a professor, or a thinker. In the eyes of the new government, you were simply non-Aryan. In July 1933, your private world was violently violated. The Frankfurt criminal police burst into your home, searching drawers full of manuscripts, stacks of records, and precious books. Imagine the feeling of a skinless person when the cold hands of power touch what is most sacred to them. The hothouse that had protected you since childhood was now shattered into pieces under the boots of Nazi soldiers. You felt the freezing cold of reality without any filtering membrane left to shield you. By September 1933, an official letter arrived. It did not carry hateful words, but the coldness of administrative procedure. Your teaching license was revoked. You were stripped of your voice in the very place where you had once begun your greatest dreams. Your application to join the Reich Chamber of Literature was rejected on the grounds that you did not belong to the German people through a deep connection of character and blood. You became a stranger in your own homeland. Every academic door, every cultural salon, every music stage in Germany now slammed shut in your face. You spent the final months of 1,933 inches, a painful state of limbo. You moved between Germany and abroad, trying to find a gap to survive. You had not yet fully accepted the reality that your sheltered life had collapsed forever. You looked at the streets of Frankfurt, the places where you grew up, now hanging with swastika flags as bright red as bloodstains on a white background. You realized that culture, the thing you always worshipped, could not stop barbarism. Beethoven could not halt the footsteps of the Gestapo. You stood at the train station, watching the busy crowds, feeling like a ghost wandering through reality. You carried with you the Kierkegaard manuscript, notes on music, and a heart gradually turning to stone before fear. You knew you had to leave, but leaving Frankfurt, leaving that ruined hothouse, was a skin-cutting pain. You were beginning to taste the flavor of exile, a state you would later describe as part of the destruction of humanity. In the darkness of a winter night in 1933, you realized that your message in a bottle was now no longer a distant philosophical metaphor. It was a survival need. You had to throw your reflections into the ocean of the future, because in the present, there was no one left willing to listen to you. You were preparing to step into a journey with no set return date, carrying the melancholy of a thinker who sees the collapse of the civilization he had always loved. You take a deep breath, feeling the scent of old books and train smoke, preparing to enter an unfamiliar chapter of life in Oxford. Your Germany, your Frankfurt, is now just a painful memory being stifled by brutality. But deep down, that skinless person is still silently sharpening his intellect, preparing for a long war with words against the darkness of ignorance. Now, imagine you are standing on the platform of Paddington Station on a day in June 1934. The thick fog of London is nothing like the fresh air of Frankfurt. It carries the smell of coal and a dampness that seeps into your very bones. You pull up the collar of your overcoat, your hand tightly gripping the suitcase filled with manuscripts and atonal musical notes. You have left Germany, which has now become a foreign and hostile land, to seek refuge at Oxford. But as you look at the gray stone walls of Merton College, you realize a harsh reality. At the age of 31, a man who was once a doctor and a respected university lecturer in Frankfurt must now register as an advanced student. This is not just a setback in status. It is a slap in the pride of an elite intellectual. You feel like a child forced back into kindergarten. You call Oxford the preschool of exile, Vorschule des Exiles. In the cold rooms of the university, where the traditions of empiricism and British common sense reign, you find yourself completely out of place. You, a skinless person carrying complex dialectical methods and the melancholy of German philosophy, must now face scholars who only believe in what can be measured and observed. Under the supervision of Gilbert Ryle, you begin writing a critique of Edmund Husserl's phenomenology. But every time you try to explain transcendence or dialectics, you encounter blank stares. Your language, an English that is still awkward, cannot convey the deep layers of your thought. You find life here gray and transactional. Everything is weighed and measured by its utility, while you only long to seek the truth hidden behind fragments. You feel stifled, like a falcon trapped in an English glass cage of politeness. The year 1935 arrives, bringing the most devastating storms to your sensitive soul. In June of that year, Aunt Agatha, your second mother, the person who taught you your first keys, the one who sheltered the hothouse of your childhood, passed away forever. Her death was like the glass wall of the hothouse being shattered, leaving you exposed to the freezing winds of reality. But the pain did not stop there. In December 1935, the great teacher, your master in music, Alban Berg, also died. The two strongest pillars supporting your emotional and artistic world collapsed at the same time. You saw the continuity of your life broken by disasters. With no Aunt Agatha to comfort you and no Berg to guide your melancholic notes, you stood in Oxford as a double exile. Exiled from your homeland and exiled from your own past. You wrote tearful lines in your diary, realizing that the old world had truly vanished, and all that remained were the fragments of a damaged life. In that ultimate solitude, you found an intellectual anchor, letters. You wrote constantly to Max Horkheimer, who had by then moved the Institute for Social Research to New York, and to Walter Benjamin, who was living precariously in Paris. Those letters were the first messages in a bottle. You exchanged ideas with Benjamin about history and art, and began recording short aphorisms, fragments of reflection on morality in a world that had lost its direction. These writings were the seeds of the later Minima Moralia. You realized that philosophy, as it alone can be practiced responsibly in the face of despair, is the attempt to contemplate all things as they would present themselves from the standpoint of redemption. Despite the pain, your pen never rested. You wrote about music with an intellectual bitterness. You published the controversial essay on jazz, Über Jazz, in 1936. In your eyes, jazz was not a symbol of freedom or improvisation, but a product of the culture industry, a standardized music meant to deceive the masses. You called it a pseudo-individuality. You also wrote The Form of the Phonograph Record, realizing that when music is frozen into black plastic grooves, it becomes a commodity, a dead object, instead of a living experience. You were sharpening your critical blade to attack every corner of modern society, where you saw humans gradually being turned into cogs in a giant machine. Your gray life in exile was brightened slightly in 1937. Gretel Karplus, the resilient woman who had stayed in Berlin throughout those years to maintain the business and support you from afar, was finally able to leave Germany. On the 8th of September, 1937, in London, the two of you were married. Imagine a simple wedding in the heart of a foreign city, without the blessings of a full family, without the glamour of the old Frankfurt salons. But to you, Gretel was the new skin you had just found again. She was not just a wife, but an editor, a transcriber of manuscripts, and the one who kept your intellectual flame from being extinguished by the gales of the era. But Oxford was still a place too narrow for your stature. You felt yourself dying academically amidst British indifference. The opportunity for escape came in June 1937, when Horkheimer invited you to New York for 2 weeks. Setting foot in America for the first time, you were overwhelmed by its bustle and sheer scale. Here, you met Paul Lazarsfeld and received an invitation to work for the Princeton Radio Research Project. It was a difficult choice. You hated empiricism. You hated having to turn philosophical reflections into statistical numbers for administrative research. But you also understood that Europe was preparing to explode. Hitler's Germany was sharpening its sword, and Britain seemed too weary to protect anyone. You faced a choice: stay in England to continue as a poor advanced student in the fog, or cross the ocean to a completely new world where the culture industry was at its peak. You returned to Oxford to pack your bags. You looked back at the years in England, years of humiliation, of painful deaths, but also years in which you had learned how to exist in absolute solitude. You realized that exile was not just a geographic state, but a state of mind. An intellectual must always be in exile, must always stand outside the system to see through it. On the first day of 1938, you and Gretel boarded the ship leaving Europe. As you watched the English coastline recede into the mist, you knew you were truly throwing your message in a bottle into an ocean more foreign than ever. You carried with you the melancholy of a person who had lost everything belonging to the hothouse, but also the determination of a thinker ready to face the monster of modernity in its very lair, America. The ship's whistle blew, drowning out the sound of the crashing waves. You held Gretel's hand tightly, feeling the cold sea breeze on your skinless face. Ahead was New York, the neon lights, the radio stations, and a new battle. You were no longer the proud young professor of Frankfurt. You were a survivor, a social anatomist preparing to dissect the heart of modern capitalism. The journey of exile at Oxford closed, leaving behind the graves of loved ones and broken musical dreams. But in your suitcase, the aphorisms of minima moralia had begun to speak, and critical theory was preparing to enter its most decisive phase. You closed your eyes, listening to the rhythm of the ship's engine, and prepared for a chapter of life where you would have to learn the slave language to be able to speak the freest truths. Take a deep breath and let the salty air of the Atlantic fill your chest. You are standing on the deck of a steamship, the 16th of February, 1938. Before you, the New York skyline emerges with skyscrapers rising from the mist like the giant fangs of a new era. You, a skinless person, carrying the scars of a burning Europe, have just set foot in the land of free dreams. But for you, this freedom carries a strange aftertaste. It is not the freedom of philosophers in the lecture halls of Frankfurt, but the freedom of neon signs and unending car horns. You and Gretel settle into a home on Riverside Drive. From the window overlooking the Hudson River, you see the swirling currents, a reminder of the aimless drift of exile. Soon after settling in, you officially join the Institute for Social Research, which is now temporarily residing at Columbia University under the protection of Max Horkheimer. You breathe a sigh of relief at seeing familiar faces, but the atmosphere here has changed. The discussions no longer carry the resonance of Frankfurt tea rooms. They are compressed into a cautious anxiety. In 1939, your parents also emigrated to the United States, helping you re-establish a small part of the old hothouse, but the glass shards have now been replaced by new, colder layers of matter. Horkheimer places you in an ambitious yet ironic project, the Princeton Radio Research Project. Imagine you with a head full of Beethoven having to travel every day to a deserted brewery in Newark, New Jersey, where the project is headquartered. Its director is Paul Lazarsfeld, a sociologist who favors numbers and empirical data. The goal of the project is to measure what American listeners like when listening to the radio. They want to optimize music to sell more advertisements. The moment you see the measuring machines with like and dislike buttons, you feel an extreme horror. To you, this is like trying to measure the soul with a ruler. You realize that culture is being turned into a pure consumer commodity. You clash fiercely with the American method of administrative research. You refuse to ask listeners what they like because you believe what people take to be their natural taste is in fact preconditioned by the structure of popular music. After just 3 months, you write a memorandum 160 pages long titled Music in Radio. You do not offer numbers, you offer dark prophecies. You argue that the radio has killed the ability for true listening. Instead of hearing a symphony as an organic whole, listeners now engage in atomistic listening. They only wait for catchy choruses and easy melodies to whistle along to. Lazarsfeld looks at your manuscript and shakes his head. He finds your writing style too difficult to understand, too philosophically heavy, and lacking in what is called scut work of data collection. By the end of 1939, when funding from the Rockefeller Foundation was cut, your portion of the research was the first to be eliminated. You find yourself once again marginalized, but this time by a system that does not use violence, but rather the indifference of statistical figures. In that frustration, you wrote one of the sharpest essays of your career on the fetish character in music and the regression of listening, über den Fetischcharakter in der Musik und die Regression des Hörens. You introduce the concept of regressive listening. You describe modern audiences as children imprisoned in a passive state. They consume music not to be liberated, but to forget the emptiness of their lives. Music is no longer art. It is a fetish, a shiny commodity for people to worship unconsciously. On weekend nights, you frequently visit clubs in Harlem or the Savoy Ballroom. You stand there an elegant European man amidst cigarette smoke and bustling saxophone sounds. You observe jazz through the eyes of a social surgeon. While the whole world praises jazz as the pinnacle of improvisation and freedom, you see in it a pseudo-individualization. You write that those colorful solos are actually just superficial variations on a formulaic commodity structure. The freedom in jazz is only an illusion mass-produced to make listeners feel unique while they are in total conformity. You see in the standardization of popular music a harbinger of the standardization of humans in dictatorial regimes. In these first years in New York, communication with Walter Benjamin is the only anchor keeping you tied to the depths of European thought. You exchange intense correspondence. You critique Benjamin's manuscript on Baudelaire. You worry for his Arcades project being threatened in Paris. But then, tragic news arrives in 1940. Walter Benjamin committed suicide at the French-Spanish border after a failed attempt to escape the Nazis. Benjamin's death deals a fatal blow to your soul. You feel a terrifying silence envelop your intellectual world. You realize that Benjamin's message in a bottle has been forever swallowed by the ocean. This pain brings you and Horkheimer closer together. You begin to plan a joint work, an effort to understand why humanity, instead of entering a truly human state, is sinking deep into a new kind of barbarism. These are the very first seeds of the book Dialectic of Enlightenment, to survive in the pragmatic American academic environment. You and Horkheimer must learn to use something called slave language. You must write reports to donors using clever linguistic codes to hide your Marxist tendencies and radical critiques. You feel humiliated having to play the role of an administrative sociologist, but you know that is the price of survival. You are living in a paradox. You critique the fakery of society, but you must use that very fakery to protect your right to think. By the end of 1940, your radio research contract ends. You face a serious financial risk. New York, the city of neon lights and noise, begins to make you feel suffocated. You feel like a fragment lost amidst the gears of the culture industry. New York has taught you a bitter lesson. Barbarism does not only come from Nazi soldiers' boots, but it can also come from the smoothness of songs played on the radio and the glamour of consumer goods. When Horkheimer decides to move to Los Angeles to seek a quieter atmosphere, you know you cannot stay. You look back at Riverside Drive one last time, looking at the unfinished manuscripts on jazz and radio. You carry with you the melancholy of Benjamin's death and the weight of a self-destructing civilization. You prepare for a transcontinental journey from the East Coast to the West Coast of the United States. Imagine you are sitting on the train heading for California. As the lights of New York fade behind you, you feel a tremendous exhaustion, but also a new resolve. You have tasted the brutality of the dictatorship in Germany, and now you have seen the softness of the consumerist regime in America. You realize that your battle no longer lies in lecture halls, but in exposing the mechanism that is turning humans into manipulated objects. You grip Gretel's hand in the darkness of the train carriage. Ahead is Los Angeles, the bright sunshine of California, where you and Horkheimer will complete the greatest indictment of Western reason. You close your eyes, but in your ears, the like and dislike buttons of the radiometer still echo a dry rhythm signaling the decay of individuality. You know that to live rightly in a wrong world, you must become a perpetual exile, even within your own language. The train speeds into the night, carrying a thinker who is preparing to throw the most important message of his life into the vast ocean of the future. Close your eyes and let the warm breeze, carrying the salty flavor of the Pacific and the heady fragrance of bougainvillea, caress your sensitive skin. You are standing on a terrace in Pacific Palisades, California, in late 1941. Before you is a natural landscape so brilliant it feels surreal. Golden sunshine pouring over coconut groves, tiny hummingbirds hovering beside vibrant flowers, and the blue sea stretching to the horizon. This is the place your fellow countrymen call German California, or a Weimar on the Pacific. With just a few minutes' walk, you might encounter a contemplative Thomas Mann, or hear the fierce debates of Bertolt Brecht. But for a skinless person like you, this paradise carries a terrifyingly cruel air. While you breathe in this peaceful atmosphere, your mind is torn apart by the crackling of the radio. News bulletins from across the ocean strike as hammer blows. Europe is engulfed in flames, and your relatives and colleagues are being driven into the gas chambers of the Holocaust. This contrast is horrific. You sit in a luxurious armchair in heaven, while your compatriots are in hell. You realize that the radiant beauty of California is merely a veil covering the reigning barbarism. Your peace at this moment is itself an expression of a damaged life. You left New York for this place at the call of Max Horkheimer. After bitter clashes with the empirical research methods on the East Coast, you needed a moment of stillness to join your kindred spirit in a supreme task, dissecting the very mind of humanity. Throughout the years, from 1941 to 1944, you and Horkheimer wove together the greatest indictment of Western civilization, the book Dialectic of Enlightenment, Dialectic der Aufklärung. Imagine the evenings when the fog began to shroud the hills, you and Horkheimer pacing back and forth in the study, debating every word, every concept. You asked an agonizing question: why mankind, instead of entering into a truly human condition, is sinking into a new kind of barbarism? The answer you found was grim. Reason itself, the weapon the Enlightenment used to liberate man from myth, had betrayed itself. It had turned into a tool of dominance. As humans tried to master nature absolutely, they also began to master and enslave one another. Reason had regressed into a powerful and cruel new myth. It was also here, right next door to the cinema capital of Hollywood, that you saw through the mechanism you called the culture industry. You stood under the bright neon lights of Los Angeles, and realized that films, music, and radio were not art, but a system of mass deception. It was designed to produce conformity and passivity. You bitterly observed that the audience was no longer the subject of culture, but merely customers consuming standardized products. The culture industry is not art, but a system of mass deception. You likened the thoughts you were writing to a message in a bottle, thrown into the ocean of the future, because in the present, it seemed no one was sober enough to hear it amidst the noise of Hollywood. Despite living among an elite exile community, you still had to face another ironic reality. As soon as America entered the war, you were classified as an enemy alien. You, who had to flee from Hitler, were now under surveillance by the American government. You were restricted in travel, not allowed to go further than 5 miles from home, and had to obey a nighttime curfew. There were nights you stood by the window, looking toward the sea, feeling like a prisoner in paradise. You were only officially naturalized as a U.S. citizen in November 1943, but the feeling of being a stranger never vanished. In your loneliest moments, when Horkheimer was busy with other projects, you began recording fragments of personal reflection, sharp aphorisms on existence. These were the seeds of Minima Moralia. You dedicated the first 50 sections to Horkheimer for his 50th birthday in 1945 as a gift of intellectual friendship. You wrote about the decay of false politeness, the pain of homelessness, and the disintegration of individuality. It is from these pages that a sentence resonating as a compass for your thought emerged. Wrong life cannot be lived rightly. Es gibt kein richtiges Leben im Falschen. You realize that in a completely alienated society, every effort to live a private, individual moral life becomes either an illusion or a lie. Although you hated numbers and soulless empiricism, you accepted participation in a large-scale research project on authoritarianism. You wanted to use the Americans' own weapons to fight the ghost of fascism. You and your colleagues developed the F scale in the book, The Authoritarian Personality. You tried to measure latent psychological traits, submission to authority, superstition, aggressiveness, things that could turn an ordinary neighbor into someone ready to nod at brutality. You were trying to unmask the monster lying right within the mental structure of modern man. Music, your most loyal friend, was always present among the California hills. You became a secret advisor to Thomas Mann as he wrote his great novel, Dr. Faustus. You sat for hours explaining Schoenberg's 1-2 tone technique to him, helping him build the character of the musician Adrian Leverkuhn, the man who sold his soul to the devil to reach the pinnacle of art. But this collaboration also brought bitterness. Arnold Schoenberg, your neighbor in Los Angeles, was furious to see his theory placed in a novel in the form of a dark curse. He accused you of stealing and distorting his thoughts. You stood between two giants, feeling the fragility of intellectual relationships when placed under the pressure of ego and history. At the same time, you completed the book Philosophy of New Music, Philosophie der Neuen Musik, where you contrasted Schoenberg's progress with the regression you attributed to Stravinsky. For you, music had to be resistance, not consolation. Even when writing about film music with Hans Eisler, you did not stop criticizing how Hollywood used music as a cheap seasoning to deceive the audience's emotions. In 1948, the war had long ended, but its echoes still weighed heavily on your chest. Sun-drenched California now began to feel suffocating. You had completed the most important works of your life here, but you knew you did not belong. Your message in a bottle was finished, but you did not want it to float forever on the blue ocean of the West Coast. You and Horkheimer began to turn your eyes back toward Europe, toward a ruined Frankfurt, where the old hothouse had shattered, but the seeds of thought remained. You stand on Santa Monica Beach one last time, watching the waves crash against the white sand. You carry with you the manuscripts of Minima Moralia, reflections on the Enlightenment, and a deep sadness about humanity. You know that returning to Germany is not about finding the past, but about starting a new battle on the ashes. You learned the slave language of survival in America, and now you prepare to use it to awaken the conscience of a nation that lost its way. The hummingbirds are still bustling in the air, but in your ears, the melancholic symphony of exile has moved to a new chapter. You pack your bags for the trip back to Europe in 1949. California gave you a shelter to think the unthinkable, but Frankfurt is where you must face the scar of history. You grip Gretel's hand, feeling the vibration of a new journey. The message in a bottle is about to be brought ashore, and you are ready to face those who will pick it up on the wasteland of a world that has just emerged from the darkness. The night train from Paris glides through the darkness, carrying you, a 4-6. Year, old man with hair beginning to gray, and a soul heavy with reflections on salvation. It is the early days of November 1949. As you look through the train window, you no longer see the vibrant palm trees of Santa Monica or the neon lights of New York. In their place is a gray, ruined landscape of post-war Germany. You are returning to the scene of the crime, returning to Frankfurt, where the hothouse of your child Hosd shattered 16 years ago. You step down onto the Frankfurt platform, taking a deep breath of the cold air, smelling of coal and rubble. The first feeling is not the relief of a traveler returning home, but an uncanny, unheimlich sensation. Your city is now filled with the scars of bombs, and the people walking the streets carry faces you cannot read. You feel like a ghost returning to the world of the living, or perhaps the opposite. This world itself is a somber realm where unredeemed spirits linger in hiding. The moment you enter the university lecture hall for the first time after 16 years of exile is a shivering experience. You stand at the lectern, looking down at the young faces of German students, the generation of children of those who once ransacked your home and stripped you of your teaching license. For a moment, you feel a suffocating uncanniness. You see, they're not just students, but as if the ghosts of the murdered Jewish intellectuals had entered the German students. They sit there, silent, listening to you speak of philosophy and ethics. While the darkness of the past remains thick in the room, you realize that you are not just teaching, you are performing an intellectual seance. Together with Max Horkheimer, you set about rebuilding the Institute for Social Research, Institut für Sozialforschung. The new building on Senckenbergenlage does not feature the ornate neo-Baroque architecture of the old university. It is built in a modern, minimalist style with straight lines and bright glass. It is a statement in architecture, a break from the dark past, an effort to build a space for critical reason in the heart of a nation trying to forget its crimes. There is a small detail, ironic yet symbolic, during this period: the Adorno lights, Adorno Ampel. You realize that crossing the busy road between the institute and the university was a hazardous venture. Therefore, you requested the city to install a traffic light right there. This incident accidentally became a topic of discussion in the press. People mocked that the great philosopher, the one specializing in analyzing the collapse of Western reason, had become an ordinary traffic regulator. But to you, that light was a symbol of the effort to maintain a small, safe order for thought amidst a world still full of underlying chaos. However, you did not yet completely belong to Germany. Throughout the 4 years from 1949 to 1953, you lived as a transatlantic commuter. You still held American citizenship, still had research commitments on the West Coast. You frequently returned to Santa Monica, breathing the sea air to temporarily forget the stifling atmosphere of Frankfurt. In America, you served as the Director of Scientific Research for the Hacker Psychiatric Foundation in Beverly Hills. Imagine the contrast. In the morning, you might be walking on a sun-drenched California beach, but in the afternoon, you sit in an office to analyze astrology columns in American newspapers. You write the work "The Stars Down to Earth," exposing how modern superstition and the belief in destiny are used to manipulate the psychology of the masses. You see in those harmless astrological predictions another form of submission to authority. You also begin researching television, the new tool of the culture industry, realizing it possesses a hypnotic power even more terrifying than the radio you once studied in New York. During this transition phase, the messages in a bottle you had been throwing into the ocean for so long finally washed ashore and were opened. In 1949, the Philosophy of New Music, Philosophie der Neuen Musik, was published just as you returned, causing an earthquake in German musical circles. You exposed the opposition between a progressive, pained Schoenberg and a regressive, compromising Stravinsky. You forced people to view music as a moral and political issue, not just entertaining melodies. In 1950, the massive empirical work, The Authoritarian Personality, was born in America. With the F scale, you provided a tool for the world to identify the seeds of fascism hiding in the psychology of ordinary people. But the work that truly turned your name into an intellectual icon in West Germany was Minima Moralia, published in 1951. This book was like a magnet, attracting all attention. Thomas Mann wrote from America to praise its magnetic attraction. People found in your melancholic aphorisms a deep empathy for the pain of human existence after the war. You wrote about the damaged life with an almost painful sharpness. The sentence, "wrong life, cannot be lived rightly, es gibt kein richtiges Leben im Falschen," now resonated across cultural forums. You offered people no positive advice, but the ultimate honesty in describing despair became an awakening potion for a society slumbering in newly emerging wealth. But that awakening was not easy. As the leader of the Institute, you undertook a daring sociological project, the Group Experiment, Gruppen Experiment, in 1950 to 1951. You wanted to probe the non-public opinions of Germans regarding the past. The results obtained were disturbing and horrific. You realized that, behind the newly established democratic shell, many Germans still held deep Nazi prejudices. You heard them mourning for houses destroyed by Allied bombs, mourning for fallen German soldiers, yet remaining completely silent before the victims of the Holocaust. They denied collective guilt by turning themselves into victims. You painfully concluded that the ghosts of the past had not disappeared. They were merely lurking deep in the subconscious, waiting for their chance. Denazification only occurred on the surface, like a new coat of paint covering deep cracks in the wall. It was also during this period that you uttered a moral manifesto that shook world culture. To write poetry after Auschwitz is barbaric. End quote. Nach Auschwitz, ein Gedicht zu schreiben, ist barbarisch. This sentence was not a ban on art, but a demand for a fundamental change in the nature of culture. How can we continue to sing, write poetry, or enjoy beauty as if nothing had happened after the genocide? How can culture claim to be humanistic when it failed to prevent the gas chambers? You demanded that art take on a new form, a form that must not soothe the pain, but must contain the very impossibility of finding meaning. Art after Auschwitz must be a fragmented art, an art that refuses false harmony. By 1952, after publishing In Search of Wagner, Versuchüber Wagner, where you exposed the pre-fascist elements hidden behind the splendor of Richard Wagner's music, you realized that your mission lay here, on this land full of contradictions. You could no longer be a commuter between two oceans. You could no longer keep fleeing into the blue skies of California when the ghosts in Frankfurt were still waiting to be named and dissected. In 1953, you made a fateful decision to settle permanently in Germany and renounce your American citizenship. It was a silent sacrifice. You gave up the safety of a superpower to venture into an uncertain future in a country that was both your homeland and the scene of the most horrific tragedies. You chose to stay to join Horkheimer in turning the Institute for Social Research into a fortress of critical thought where you would spend the rest of your life teaching Germans how to look in the mirror and face their own scars. You stand on the terrace of the new Institute building, looking down at the traffic stopping before the Adorno lights. You feel a giant weight on your shoulders, but also a strange serenity. The old hothouse has broken, but now you are trying to build a new space, not to protect flowers from the storm, but so that humans can see the storm most clearly. The Frankfurt church bells ring in the distance. You turn inside, where new manuscripts await, where students with uncanny souls await your lectures. You know that your true journey of exile has only just begun. An exile in your very own homeland. An exile to protect the truth in a world that is in a hurry to forget. You take a deep breath and begin to write because you know that the message in a bottle has finally found the shore, and your job is to ensure that its echo will never fade into the silence of indifference. Imagine you are sitting in your new office at the Institute for Social Research in Frankfurt on an autumn morning in 1953. After 4 years of living the life of a commuter, drifting on transatlantic ships, you have finally made a fateful decision to settle permanently in Germany. You renounce your American citizenship, giving up the safety of the West Coast to return to live and think amidst the ashes of your homeland. You realize that the Darwinian academic environment in America, where knowledge is turned into a fierce race for survival, is stifling your capacity for reflection. You return to Frankfurt not to find peace, but to fulfill the duty of an intellectual toward a nation trying to wipe out its memory. In 1955, you officially became the co-director of the Institute alongside Max Horkheimer, and a year later, you were appointed as an ordinarius, full professor of philosophy and sociology. You return to your old school, where you were once stripped of your right to teach, but now, with a completely different stature. You are no longer the vulnerable, skinless young doctor, but an intellectual giant carrying the bitter experiences of exile. But look at the way you appear before your students. While veteran German professors still cling to rigid suits and stale academic rituals, you walk into the lecture hall in a simple windbreaker. That windbreaker is not just a piece of clothing. It is a manifesto of unconventionality, an effort to tear through the velvet curtain of false solemnity that once shielded barbarism. You bring a new breeze, a breath of freedom and authenticity to a campus that still reeks of old-fashioned conservatism. Your influence is no longer confined within the stone walls of the Institute. You quickly become a leading public intellectual in West Germany. Your voice, both profound and carrying a characteristic melancholic resonance, rings out across the radio waves of Hesse Radio or Southwest Radio. You appear on television, Participate in roundtable discussions, using your sharp intellect to dissect the burning issues of society. You write articles for the Frankfurter Allgemeine, or Die Zeit, turning abstract philosophical concepts into tools for modern people to understand their own suffering. The most important moment in your public career came in November 1959. You stand before the public and lecture on the meaning of working through the past. Was bedeutet, Aufarbeitung der Vergangenheit. You do not use soothing words. You launch a direct attack on the collective amnesia of the Germans. You warn them that National Socialism did not disappear simply by lowering the swastika flags. It still exists as a ghost in the social consciousness, in the unreformed structures of families and schools. You say, the survival of National Socialism within democracy is potentially more menacing than the survival of fascist tendencies against democracy. You demand that the Germans must not be allowed to forget, because only by facing the bitterest truth can the return of barbarism be prevented. You are using your own brain to serve as a mirror for an entire nation. But your intellectual battle does not stop at history. In 1961, in Tübingen, I initiated the positivist dispute, Positivist Mustrit, with the philosopher Karl Popper. You vehemently criticized the style of sociology that only knows how to use statistical numbers and quantitative data to describe humans. To you, turning humans into dry variables is just another form of enslavement. You argue that society is an entity full of dialectical contradictions, and true knowledge must penetrate those contradictions rather than flattening them with soulless charts. You do not accept a world where truth is reduced to what can be measured. Amidst those heated debates, music remains the place you return to for contemplation. At the International Summer Courses for New Music in Darmstadt, you stand among ambitious young composers like Stockhausen or Boulez. But it is here that you utter the warning about the aging of the new music, das Altern der neuen Musik. You realize that the atonal techniques that once represented freedom are now becoming rigid and lifeless in the hands of the younger generation. You fear that art is losing its character of resistance to become a pure technical craft. During these years, your messages in a bottle are continuously sent to readers through monumental works. You published Prismen in 1955, which contains icy cultural critiques. You write Notes to Literature, Noten zur Literatur, offering clairvoyant insights into Kafka, Proust, and especially Samuel Beckett. Your relationship with Beckett is a strange intersection between two souls who both see the ruins of meaning. When you meet Beckett in Paris in 1958, you realize that his play Endgame is the perfect illustration of your philosophy. You write the essay Trying to Understand Endgame, Versuch, das Endspiel zu verstehen. Considering Beckett the only writer daring enough to stand firm on the ashes of civilization to speak the truth about meaninglessness. To you, Beckett's silence speaks more than any eloquent manifesto. However, there is one target you never let go of, Martin Heidegger. In 1964, you published The Jargon of Authenticity, Jargon der Eigentlichkeit. You use your pen like a sword to pierce through Heidegger's mysterious, mythical linguistic shell. You argue that terms like angst or authenticity are actually just hollow jargon, used to cover up a lack of social responsibility and to serve a silent submission. You hate ambiguity. You hate everything that tries to divinize existence while real humans are being crushed by power structures. In 1963, you were elected president of the German Sociological Association. You are at the height of your fame and intellectual power. You are the teacher of an entire generation of West German youth students who are hungering for total change. They look to you, the windbreaker-wearing professor, the former exile, the man who dares to speak the most difficult truths, as a lighthouse of free thought. Imagine you are walking through the corridors of the University of Frankfurt, surrounded by a crowd of admiring students. You have succeeded in rebuilding the institute, succeeded in making critical theory the heart of German spiritual life. You feel you have fulfilled the duty of an intellectual, unmasking illusions and awakening conscience. But deep down, the skinless person in you still senses an underlying instability. You see your students beginning to become radicalized. They want to turn your critical theories into violent political actions on the streets. You start to wonder, do they truly understand what you are teaching? Or are they just replacing one form of dogma with another? On quiet nights at your home in Frankfurt, as you sit beside Gretel and listen to the symphonies of Mahler music you just described in your book Mahler, a musical physiognomy. As a premonition of collapse, you feel a creeping melancholy. The world is changing rapidly. The brilliant and turbulent 1960s lie ahead. You have brought the message in a bottle to shore, but you begin to realize that the sea waves are preparing to rise once more, and this time they might sweep away even the one who sent it. You stand by the window looking out at the Frankfurt streets where the Adorno lights are still steadily changing colors. Red, yellow, green. A small order in a world full of fractures. You take a deep breath, preparing for the next lectures, unaware that the students who worship you today will soon become the ones to present you with the harshest challenges of your life. Until this moment, in 1965, you are still the uncrowned king of German intellect, but the shadow of resistance is beginning to loom long over the lecture halls, signaling an endgame that even you cannot foresee. Let your breath slow down deeply and imagine yourself sitting in a quiet office in Frankfurt on a late evening in 1966. The ticking of the desk clock seems louder than usual, and before you is the final manuscript of a work you have spent your entire life nurturing. Negative Dialectics, Negative Dialectic. At the age of 63, you feel the weight of time and historical upheavals pressing down on the shoulders of a skinless person. But in your intellect, a fire still burns, a melancholic yet steadfast fire, wanting to illuminate the darkest corners of human thought. To you, philosophy has for a long time committed a fatal error that you call identity thinking. It is the tendency to want to reduce every individual object, every specific pain, into abstract, polished concepts. You want to liberate thought from the trap of Hegelian harmonious synthesis. You propose a negative dialectic, a relentless negation, to protect the non-identity of things. You want the world to see what is left out, what cannot be framed into systems. And amidst those dry philosophical lines, you have set a new categorical imperative for humanity, a vow written in blood and tears. Arrange your thoughts and actions so that Auschwitz will not repeat itself, so that nothing similar will happen again. But while you are reaching the pinnacle of thought, the world outside the lecture hall is beginning to simmer. A new generation of students, those who grew up on your lectures, those who consider you a lighthouse of liberation, now begin to turn and interrogate their own teacher. They are young, they are enthusiastic, and they hunger for something you have always been wary of: praxis. They want direct action. They want to take to the streets. They want to smash the system immediately. You stand there, the windbreaker-wearing professor of freedom, but now you feel yourself being pushed into an ironic position. To you, impulsive action without the insight of theory is merely a form of pseudo-activity. You see in their blinded fervor a familiar ghost from the past. You do not hesitate to call it left fascism. You fear that when people stop thinking only to act, they will inadvertently recreate the very barbarism they wish to oppose. Your extreme sensitivity makes you see the scars of power, even in the smiles of resistance. That relationship shattered into sharp fragments. In January 1969, a group of radical students occupied the very Institute for Social Research, the intellectual home that you and Horkheimer had painstakingly rebuilt from the ruins. Imagine the pain of someone whose home was once ransacked by the Gestapo, now seeing his own students breaking down the doors of academic freedom. In a moment of despair and faith in the legal order, you performed an action that would later become a wound that never heals. You called the police. The sound of police sirens before the institute gates was the death knell for the bond between you and the younger generation. To them, you had become a traitor, a part of the authoritarian system. But to you, it was the final act to protect the space of thought from the coercion of violence, regardless of which side that violence came from. The tragedy reached its peak on a morning in April 1969. You entered the lecture hall to deliver your lecture as usual, but instead of admiring gazes, you faced a plan of cruel mockery. 3 female students rushed to the lectern, suddenly bared their breasts, and scattered flower petals over your head. People called it the breast attack, Busenattentat. In that moment, imagine the humiliation of an elite intellectual, someone who always valued the seriousness of aesthetics and thought. The petals fell like the shards of a final dignity. You, the skinless one, felt insulted to the very core of your being. You said not a word, only silently picked up your briefcase and hat, then turned and fled from the lecture hall amidst the laughter of the crowd. That was the last time you stood at that lectern. The world of refinement, of Beethoven and Kant that you had always protected, was now being trampled by a culture you no longer recognized. You retreated into solitude, pouring your final strength into your largest and most melancholic project, aesthetic theory, aesthetisch theory. You intended to dedicate this book to Samuel Beckett, the friend who shared your vision of humanity's endgame. You wrote of an art that must not be falsely beautiful, an art that must contain the pain of existence. You wanted to prove that even in ruins, beauty can still exist as a negation of the world's wrongness. But that book would forever remain an unfinished manuscript, just like your own contradictory life. Your health began to collapse rapidly. The confrontations, the insults in the press, and the feeling of being betrayed by the very seeds you had sown eroded your heart. You fell into a severe state of exhaustion and depression. Speeches like Education After Auschwitz, Erziehung nach Auschwitz, still echoed on the radio like a final call in the desert, reminding people to abolish blind conformity to prevent barbarism. But it seemed your voice was gradually being drowned out by the screams of the era. In July 1969, to seek a bit of final peace and escape the stifling heat of Frankfurt, you and Gretel went on holiday to the Visp region of Switzerland. Imagine standing among the towering peaks, where the air is thin and cold, looking down at the lush green valley. Here, it seemed the noise of the student movement, the police sirens, and the humiliating flower petals all receded. You wanted to be free once more. Wanted once more to transcend your own limits. Despite the doctor's advice about your already exhausted heart, in early August, you attempted a mountain climb at an altitude of 3,000 meters. Perhaps you wanted to find the feeling of the hothouse of your childhood, or perhaps you wanted to prove that reason and will could still triumph over matter. But standing on that peak, amidst the freezing snowy wind, your heart could no longer endure. The abnormally fast beats signaled the end. On the 6th of August, 1969, At a small clinic in Visp, you took your last breath, following a sudden heart attack. You passed away at the age of 65, leaving behind a world still in flames and unfinished pages about beauty. A death peaceful in sleep, but occurring after a life full of the scars of damage. Your funeral was held at the Frankfurt main cemetery. Max Horkheimer, the kindred spirit, the one who walked with you through the days of exile in America, who wrote the indictment of civilization with you, stood there, reading the eulogy with choking emotion. Horkheimer looked at your coffin and knew that an era had closed. Your message in a bottle had finally truly washed ashore, but the one who sent it was no longer there. You were buried near where you grew up, near where the old hothouse once existed. On your grave, no hollow words were engraved, only the name, Theodor W. Adorno. But your legacy, the painful sensitivity, the uncompromising negative dialectics, and the desperate love for truth remains. You lived a skinless life, letting all the pain of the 20th century pierce through you and transform them into great reflections for humanity. Now, as night falls and the city of Frankfurt sinks into sleep, the Adorno lights still steadily change colors. Red, yellow, green. A quiet rhythm reminding us of a person who spent a lifetime warning about barbarism and searching for a gap for salvation. Your words still echo in the darkness. To write poetry after Auschwitz is barbaric, but your life itself was a painful poem. A poem of negation, of barbarism, to affirm that humans can still think, can still resist, and can still hope for a right life, even in the midst of a wrong world. Rest now, our melancholic thinker. Your message has been received, and the fragments you left behind will forever be the bricks for us to build a more humane world, a world where no child has to tremble before mockery in the schoolyard, and no soul has to live in exile in their own homeland. The noise outside recedes, leaving only your heartbeat slowing down steadily. The imagery of Frankfurt City, the somber piano melodies, the unfinished manuscript pages full of reflection, all have flowed into a stream, and amidst that stream remains a gentle message. Sensitivity is never a weakness. It can be melancholic, it can be lonely, but it is always there like a lamp, illuminating the dark corners, reminding us of a desperate love for the truth. You take a deep breath, then exhale slowly. The figure of Theodor Adorno fades, giving way to the gentle void of sleep. Like the piano music fading behind a door, like the traffic lights at a Frankfurt intersection slowly dimming, leaving you only to hear the passing wind and your own breath. Everything settles, softly, slowly. You let your eyes gradually close, so the story turns into a gentle dream, where there are no more hothouses or scars of the past, bringing you into a night that is deep and still.